A few days before, the U.S. government had received a video message from Osama bin Laden in which he appeared with his beard dyed dark. And Liz said that Robert Spencer had explained why. And I told her, oh, I know why. It's because according to Islamic law, it's only permissible to dye one's beard black during time of war to convey an aura of youthfulness and virility. And Liz said, how did you know that? I've got to introduce you to Robert. So she took me over and introduced me to the director of Jihad Watch. I was quite excited because I was a fan and still am. She explained to him that I too knew the secret of bin Laden's beard. Which sounds like a Hardy Boys book, doesn't it? The Secret of bin Laden's Beard. Robert thought that he might be encountering a fellow scholar of Islam, and so he said, oh, have you been reading from the Shafi'i school of Islamic jurisprudence, or perhaps Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi's book, The Lawful and Prohibited in Islam? No, I said, I've been reading you. I, like countless thousands of others, had been reading and learning daily for years and continue to from Robert's tireless, incisive work in his now 18 books and hundreds of articles and videos about Islam, and on the most informative internet source about Islam and its threat to our civilization, his Jihad Watch website. In less than 4 years after Pearl Harbor, America had defeated both Nazism and Japanese imperialism. By contrast, we just passed the 17th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and we are still at war with the enemy who attacked us that day, largely because we seem unwilling even to identify who and what the enemy is. If there were ever a more authoritative guide for dragging us out of our denial and cutting through the politically correct veils obscuring Islam, it's Robert Spencer. And he just happens to have, as Mike mentioned, a new book, the amazingly thorough The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to present today the Wednesday Morning Club special guest, Robert Spencer.
Thank you very much for being here. It's always a pleasure and an honor to speak to the Wednesday Morning Club. And of course, my great honor to be affiliated with the David Horowitz Freedom Center. As you know, David is one of the great men of our age, and it's tremendous to be able to work with him and with the great Mike Finch and everybody else involved with the center. The 17th anniversary of 9/11 has indeed just passed, and you can think that on December 7th, 1958, the only people who were thinking about the Nazis and the Japanese war machine were historians and ex-military men who were reminiscing. But of course, we're still in the thick of this, and I think Americans find this puzzling. Even just the other day, there was a piece in Politico that was absolutely just appalling, really. He said, finally, 17 years after 9/11, Americans are forgetting about terrorism, and that's good. And of course, the thrust of the piece was that the threat itself was exaggerated. And he did grant, however, that the author of the piece, who's a professor at Dartmouth College, he said that, now granted, Al-Qaeda and ISIS are likely to be with us for a few more years, possibly even decades. And I thought, he actually thinks it's going to be over that soon? And this is something that General Petraeus also said a few years back when he was still in command in Afghanistan. He said that this conflict with terrorism worldwide could take up to 10 years to wrap up. And I think the optimism of these people is just off the charts. What they don't realize, and what very few people realize, is that this is a struggle that has gone on for 1,400 years. And that Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and Abu Sayyaf and all the other Hamas and Hezbollah, all the other jihad terror groups in the world today, they are not organizations that were created in order to achieve an end, and once they achieve it, they will go out of business. They are, as far as they're concerned, the latest exponents of this 1400-year struggle, and they will pass it on to their children and their grandchildren, just as they received it from their fathers and grandfathers. This is a struggle that began, according to Islamic tradition, with Muhammad when he unified the tribes of Arabia and when he began to wage jihad against non-Muslims, massacring the Jews of Arabia, taking the war against the Christian Byzantine Empire toward the end of his life. After he died, the jihadis stormed out of Arabia and took advantage of the weakness of the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. They were the two great powers of the day, but they had fought a series of wars against each other. Many, many wars against each other in the century before the advent of Islam. And by the time of the advent of Islam, they were both depleted militarily and economically. So the Arabs were able to take advantage of that and amass this huge empire that within 100 years of Muhammad's death, which is traditionally held to be 632, by 732, you have jihadis in France, fighting in central France, in Tours, against Charles Martel. You have jihadis controlling Spain. You have them controlling North Africa, the Middle East, and having conquered the Persian Empire, one of the great powers of the day, having ventured into India, and having also knocked back on its heels the other great power of the day, the Byzantine Empire. And of course, all of this has continued throughout history without any let-up. There are three things that I actually wanted to tell you about Islamic history today. I'd like to actually just read the book to you because, you know, I've written 18 books, and I've got to tell you, I'm very happy with this one. As Mike said, this is my best book. I'm not happy with all my books. I'm not going to tell you which ones I'm not happy with, but there are some I think could have been much better. But this one, man, this one's right on the money. And I could just read it all to you, but I just finished reading the audiobook, and it took 18 hours. So I'm not sure that all of you have that much time. I thought that instead I'll just digest three main points here today. The first one, that is the first and I think primary lesson of Islamic history, is that there's no let-up, that jihad is constant. We are taught today that jihad is being pursued by a tiny minority of extremists who have twisted and hijacked a peaceful religion, and that the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful and reject and abhor and are humiliated by the actions of the jihadis. And there are extremists in all religions, and so we cannot generalize or paint all Muslims with a broad brush. Have you ever heard all this? Only about 5 times today, right? And every day since 9/11. But if you look into Islamic history, there's always jihad. There is no period of tolerance or coexistence or an era of good feeling. There is nothing but jihad, always. Everywhere Muslims go, there are jihadis among them who pick fights with the non-Muslims. And they fight the non-Muslims until they subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law or convert them to Islam. This is something that is carried out not by a tiny minority of extremists, but by the mainstream authorities in Islam. You have, for example, after Muhammad, there's the period known as the period of the Khalifa Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs. This is the first Islamic golden age. The 4 successors of Muhammad, caliph means successor, and the caliph is the successor of Muhammad as the military, political, and spiritual leader of the Muslims. After Muhammad dies, you have 4 men who succeed him who are known as the rightly guided caliphs. These are the guys who really have it right. Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, taking from the year 632 to 661. And 2 of them were murdered. 2 of them faced civil wars. Right after Muhammad died, many of the tribes of Arabia said, "Oh, Muhammad's dead? Well, okay, goodbye. We're not Muslims anymore." And Abu Bakr said, "Sorry, this is a room with no exit door. You're going to stay Muslims." And he fought what is known as the Wars of Apostasy. and got them back. And then he died rather quickly, 2 years after he took office, and was succeeded by Umar, who oversaw the conquests of the Holy Land and Egypt, who followed by Uthman, who extended those conquests, and Ali, who he was more in the civil war mode again, because you remember Aisha. You've probably heard of Aisha. Aisha being Muhammad's child bride, and he was 54 when he raped her. She was 9. And they were married for 9 years until he died when she was 18. And she was a very strong-willed individual. There's a story in Islamic history, Islamic tradition, that one time the Muslims all went on a caravan. And the caravan was going through the desert, and they stopped for a minute to rest. And Aisha went over the hill to, as the story puts it, answer the call of nature. Now, Aisha was about 12 years old at this time, and she's being carried in a howdah. You know, it's a little box, and it's got those poles on four poles on each, two on each side, and a couple of guys pick her up and put her on the back of the camel. They can't look at her because she's veiled in the first place. She's completely covered, and she's Muhammad's wife, which is even more. You're not allowed to look at Muhammad's wives or speak to them. So they pick her up and put her on the back of this camel. When they all stop, she gets out and goes around the hill, but then she lost one of her bracelets. So she's looking around in the sand for her lost bracelet. The guys come along and they pick up the thing and they put it back on the camel's back. She's about 12 years old. She probably doesn't weigh much of anything, so they don't notice that she ain't in it. And they go on. So she's stranded in the desert without her cell phone. Along comes a young strapping Muslim warrior who is appalled when he sees her, the mother of the believers. That's what they called her, this little 12-year-old girl. And he puts her on the back of his camel, and they race and they catch up with the caravan. Now, a man and a woman not married to each other are alone together. You know what that means. And this is what is always assumed in Islamic culture. So Aisha was accused of adultery and was about to be stoned to death. Muhammad really liked her, and so he was very upset about this. And he was so upset that at one point, while Aisha is sitting there, and Muhammad's over here, and Muhammad won't speak to her, and Aisha is crying, and Muhammad is angry, and everybody's upset, Ali says to Muhammad, "Why are you so upset? Why don't you just let her be stoned to death? You can always get another wife. What's the big deal?" Aisha heard this, and she hated Ali forever. And that's why we have Sunnis and Shiites. Because when Muhammad died, the party, there was a group, the Shiite Ali, the party of Ali, that said, Ali is the guy. He's the one who was chosen to succeed Muhammad. And Aisha said, oh no, he wasn't. I was right here when he died. He didn't say anything about Ali. And Ali was passed over at Aisha's insistence for the caliphate 3 times. Finally, he got it, and she got Muawiyah, who was a general, to fight against him. And she directed the battle. It's called the Battle of the Camel in the year 658. She directed the camel from another one of these howdahs, from another one of these howdahs on the back of the camel, which is why it's called the Battle of the Camel. But not surprisingly, her field of vision was a bit obscured, and so he was able to move and she wasn't, and so he won the battle and was magnanimous in victory. He did not have her put to death. But the split was solidified and was absolutely solidified for all time a little bit later at Karbala in Iraq, when the Sunnis and the Shiites made their final formal break after the son of Ali, Hussein, was killed by Yazid, the son of Muawiyah, in a battle. The jihad between the Sunnis and the Shia, of course, continues to this day, and that's what's behind the Saudi Arabia and Iran tensions that are ongoing, and the bombardment of Saudi Arabia from Yemen by Iran-backed rebels. In any case, The jihad against non-Muslims, of course, continued and was pursued by the Umayyad Caliphate, which is what we call Muawiyah made the caliphate into a dynastic thing. He passed it on to his son and his grandchildren and so on. And that's the Umayyad Caliphate, the first Islamic dynasty, supplanted by the Abbasid Caliphate, which was in turn supplanted by the Ottoman Caliphate. And that brings us up to 1924. There were also some offshoots. There was an Umayyad prince who fled to Spain, and he created tolerant, pluralistic Muslim Spain. Have you ever heard about this paradise of multiculturalism and coexistence that was Muslim Spain? Well, this is another lesson in the fact that there was never any let-up in jihad activity. Muslim Spain was not really all that great. You might be surprised to learn. But there are, of course, concerted efforts nowadays to rewrite history, to manipulate us into supporting modern-day political positions. So the powers that be, the political elites, they want us to support the mass Muslim migrant influx into Europe. And so one of the things that they've done is create this myth of a wonderful Muslim Spain to soften us up and make us think, well, it's not going to be so bad. It'll be like Cordoba. Well, this is what Cordoba was like. This is an account by Ibn Hayyan, who was a Muslim historian of the day, in the court of Abdurrahman III, who was one of the Umayyad caliphs of Cordoba. And one day, Abdurrahman III was looking for some entertainment, and this is what he found. Muhammad, one of the officers of Abdurrahman III, chose the 100 most important barbarians, that is, the Christians, and sent them to the Alcazar of Cordoba, where they arrived on Friday, March 2nd, 939. But Abdurrahman was vacationing in the orchard of An-Nawra. They were taken there. Their marching coinciding with the people's exiting from the Al-Hama Mosque of Cordoba upon the conclusion of Friday prayer. Okay, so you see, he took 100 Christians, more or less at random, and he's marching them to his summer house, or wherever his vacation house. It's March. And the people see this coming out of the mosque, and they follow. Many gathered and followed to see what end the prisoners would have. And it turned out that Abdurrahman was installed on the upper balcony over the orchard facing the river to watch the execution. All the prisoners, one by one, were decapitated in his presence and under his eyes, in plain sight of the people whose feelings against the infidels Allah alleviated. And they showered their blessings on the caliph. See, everybody had a good day, because the Quran says in chapter 9, verse 14, fight them, and Allah will punish them by your hands. See, the Muslims are the executors of the wrath of Allah against the infidels. Fight them, and Allah will punish them by your hands, and will soothe the breasts of the believers. So if you're feeling sad and depressed and lonely, kill an infidel. You'll feel much better. And this is what happened in Cordoba. This is a more or less typical incident. These 100 people are chosen at random. They're marched across to this other place and decapitated in public, and the crowd is thrilled, because this is the sort of thing that they expect. People say that Islamic terrorism is a modern-day invention, but there are incidents of this kind running through Islamic history without any let-up. So, not only was there no let-up, not only is this a constant of Islamic history, but it was also mainstream. You'll notice that it's the caliphates that I'm talking about. The caliphate is supposedly the only government to which all Muslims owe allegiance. Now, there's never been a caliphate that actually united all the Muslims, but nonetheless, for the caliph to do something, it's mainstream. It's not a tiny minority of extremists who've hijacked the religion. It's the chief exponent of Islam in the world. And these are the people who were pursuing jihad all throughout history. The second lesson from Islamic history today is that there was no internal resistance. This tiny minority of extremists that hijacked the religion, you would expect that if that were really the case, then there would be some massive organization of Muslims trying to make sure that these other Muslims stopped hijacking the religion. But there has never been in Islamic history any Muslim organization or any group of Muslims anywhere at any time that was trying to stop jihad violence. Ever. Now, last time I said that in public, this guy raised his hand and said, Zuhdi Jasser. Well, that just proves my point, you see. Because there's one guy, and he's a very nice fellow, you know, and everybody likes him. And the thing about it is that he represents no form of Islam that has ever existed and no interpretation of the Quran that has ever been propagated by Islamic scholars. And there has never been any kind of an Islam such as what he represents. It's as if I were to say, well, you know, I'm a Christian, but I'm a real Christian. I believe in the golden monkey God. And those people who talk about Jesus Christ and all that, that's not real Christianity. I'm the real Christian. That's Zuhdi Jasser. So, what about reform? People always ask me also, well, what are the chances of Islamic reform? Can we get some, is there any possibility, are you optimistic about Islamic reform? I'll tell you something, you should be pessimistic about Islamic reform. You should hope there's no reform. Yeah. Why? Because there has been plenty of reform. You want Islamic reform? I got it. In the 18th century, there was Islamic reform. Reform is, after all, taking something that you think has strayed from its original mission and bringing it back. Stripping away later additions that aren't in keeping with the spirit of the thing and getting back to the basics, right? Isn't that what reform is? There have been many movements of reform in Islamic history. And the most famous was indeed the one that I just mentioned. In the 18th century, there arose a reformer in Arabia who said, I'm going to strip away everything that's been added to Islam and get back to just what the Quran and Muhammad teach. And he began to gain a following. As a matter of fact, his following really started to take off in numbers when he personally stoned an accused adulteress to death. And people thought, oh, that's great, this guy, he's the real thing. And he began to gain the confidence of some of the local chieftains in the area. He began to make war against the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, of course, that's the caliphate. But he was saying the caliphate has strayed from real Islam. And he died in 1792, but he and one of the chieftains who was his chief patron, their work continued, was carried on by successors, and ultimately they began a state that still exists today, which is known as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The patron's name was Ibn Saud, and the reformer's name was Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Wahhabism is the official religion of Saudi Arabia, and it is pure, unadulterated Islam. It's reformed Islam. It's the concentrated thing, without any admixture of anything else. And, of course, the Saudis have spent billions of dollars to spread Wahhabism around the world, which is very important because there were some areas of the world where jihad had actually fallen by the wayside. I have a chapter in here called, let me see which chapter it is. It's chapter 8. It's called degringolade, which is a great word. Degringolade means a rapid decline. So if your football team loses 5 in a row, they're experiencing a degringolade. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, jihad underwent a degringolade. There was jihad to some degree, but the Ottoman Empire was in steep decline. So was the Mughal Empire in India. And so there was a falling off of jihad activity. There was no reform of Islam. There was nobody who said, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't make war against and subjugate infidels. Maybe we should coexist peacefully. There was nobody saying that. It was just that the Islamic authorities did not have the wherewithal to pursue the jihad. And so they're developed in some areas of the world, East Africa, Central Asia, even Eastern Europe to some degree, a form of Islam that it didn't teach anything different, but it just didn't emphasize jihad violence. And there was a measure of coexistence with non-Muslims in these areas, to some degree. But then the Wahhabis came in after the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia struck oil in 1938. The Wahhabis started spending all this money on spreading Wahhabism. They would go into these areas with pamphlets. One of the most notorious is called Jihad, the Forgotten Obligation. And they said, look, you're Muslims, you have to wage jihad against infidels. You can't be nice to your Christian neighbors, you got to go and wage jihad against them. There's a story actually out of the Ottoman Empire of just exactly that happening. And this woman recounts that her husband came home and said, I've just been at the mosque, and they told me I have to kill the neighbors. And she said, what do you mean you have to kill the neighbors? We've lived next door to these people for 30 years, and they're our friends. They've had dinner here, we've had dinner there, well, they're our friends. They're Christians, but they're our friends. And he said, the imam told me I have to kill them, and he went over and he did it. There's stories like that actually out of Syria at the beginning of the Civil War, of Muslims who were close friends with Christians in mixed villages who suddenly turned on their old friends and killed the Christians. These things are a matter of the jihad taking claim on one's loyalty that overrides everything else, because it's a command of Allah. So, all through this kind of thing happening, we don't see any organization that is among Muslims that is trying to stop it. It is happening in the mainstream, and even though there are peaceful Muslims, they do not do anything to stop the jihadis. And the third lesson of Islamic history is that jihadis have always had help from infidels. There have always been non-Muslims who have aided the jihad. And I was just telling you all about the Wahhabis. We might never have heard of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab or Wahhabism were it not for our friends the British. Because the British wanted to weaken the Ottoman Empire. And at the time when it was widely known as the sick man of Europe, they noticed the Wahhabis in the mid-19th century, and they started bankrolling them. And they sent them considerable sums of money for the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th, which gave the Wahhabis a significant advantage over other groups in Arabia that were vying for control and other groups in the local area. And the British favored the Saudis when there was a dispute between them and the Hashemite dynasty, which they gave Jordan as a consolation prize. But the Hashemites are actually from Arabia and have a better claim over the rulership of Arabia than the Saudis do, but the British wanted the Saudis in there. And so we got Wahhabism and global jihad, terrorism of the modern age, thanks to the British. This is something that goes back all the way to the beginning of Islamic history. You know, of course, that Spain, tolerant, pluralistic Muslim Spain was conquered in the early part of the 8th century. The Muslims invaded in 711, not at a 711, but in the year 711. And they conquered the whole thing almost by 718. In 711, they would never have been able to do it had it not been for a Christian count named Count Julian of Ceuta. Ceuta is a part of Spain, but it is in North Africa. It's still actually part of Spain. Right now it's overrun by migrants who are scaling the fence and getting into Spain that way. But it is Spain, it's just in North Africa. And so Count Julian of Ceuta, he sent his daughter to be educated at the court of the Visigothic king of Spain, King Roderick. But King Roderick behaved toward interns kind of like Bill Clinton. And so Count Julian was outraged at what had happened to his daughter. And he was burning for revenge. He had to get back at Roderick. And so he had an idea. He went next door to the North African ruler of Muslim North Africa, Tariq ibn Ziyad. And he said to Tariq ibn Ziyad, look, I'll lend you my boats, and you can get across the strait. Because, you see, when the Muslims' boats started to approach Spain, then the Spanish would see them and put up their defenses. But he figured they'll see Count Julian's boats and figure, oh, it's our pal Count Julian, and they won't put up their defenses. And that's exactly what happened. Tariq ibn Ziyad, with his men, crossed into Spain. They landed at Mons Calpe, which is a big rock at the southernmost tip of Spain, that was later named for Tariq ibn Ziyad, Jebel Tariq, or Gibraltar. And there, Tariq burned Count Julian's boats, which I think was, not very nice with a loner, but anyway, I did burn my last rental car though, so. Count Julian didn't matter at this point because Tariq had achieved what he wanted. He burned the boats because he was saying to his men, look, we are here now, we're here to stay. We may die here, or we may conquer this place, but we're not going back. Now, as an aside, let me tell you something about how it's so important to know this history nowadays. A few years back, there was a controversy that some of you may remember about a charter school in Minneapolis. It was a public school, it received public funding, taxpayer money, but it was essentially a madrasa. It had only Muslim students, and they studied Quran during the school day, and they had prayers during the school day. So there was a bit of a controversy when this was discovered, and people were saying this place should not be receiving public funding, which is perfectly reasonable. And the school ultimately was closed down. But in all the controversy about it, I never saw anybody exhibit the slightest modicum of curiosity about why the school was named Tariq ibn Ziyad Academy. Can you think of one reason why they might have named a school in Minneapolis after Tariq ibn Ziyad? Could it possibly be that they were trying to signal to the students and to the parents, we are here now and we're going to conquer or die here, but we're not going back? Anyway, we owe Muslim Spain to Tariq ibn Ziyad, and of course it took 700 years to reconquer it, and this is one of the only times that a jihad has been turned back. And finally the Muslims by 1492 were driven out of Spain, and the last Muslim kingdom ended in that year. But the resistance actually began immediately. There was one man, Pelayo, and he was up north in Spain, in Asturias, and he was not going to submit. And he didn't care, he wasn't going to submit. And he had about 30 followers, and they went up on the high mountain, and the Muslims actually sent jihadis to kill them, but they controlled the mountain passes, so they could throw stones down on any armies coming up, and it's just one little pass up the mountain, so they could stay there indefinitely. And ultimately, the Muslim commander in the area said, look, we're wasting our time. Who cares about 30 barbarians perched on a rock? They'll die off. They didn't die off. They grew and gained more territory and became the basis of the Reconquista in Spain. And it was from that one little tiny group that the whole thing was ultimately reconquered. But there was another guy who tried to make sure that that would not happen. And he was a bishop, Bishop Opas of Toledo. And Bishop Opas went up the mountain, and he spoke to Pelayo, and he said, I believe that you understand how the entire army of the Goths cannot resist the force of the Muslims. How then can you resist on this mountain? Listen to my advice. Abandon your efforts, and you will enjoy many benefits alongside the Muslims. I think that, I've never been in there, but I bet if I were to go into Pope Francis's office, there's probably a big picture of Opas. And he tries to emulate him in every way. And there are, of course, many, many other examples that I could give you had we time of non-Muslims who have aided the jihad for their own short-sighted purposes. Generally, they don't know or care that they are enabling what is ultimately an implacable force that is going to turn on them despite their goodwill. John VI Cantacuzene was the Byzantine emperor in the year 1345, and there arose a rival claimant to the Byzantine throne. So John VI had this great idea. He would ask the Ottoman Sultan to go and fight against this rival claimant. And he invited the Ottomans to go into Europe to fight against his rival, and he would do the Ottoman Sultan some reciprocal favors. And of course, the Sultan was only too happy to comply. The Muslim armies entered Eastern Europe for the first time, and they never left. They're still there. The Ottomans, of course, are gone, but the Turks still control a small bit of Europe, and on that basis are claiming NATO membership and so on, which would be the end of, not NATO membership, European Union membership, which would be the end of the European Union because it's a voting by population thing, and Turkey's population is such that they would control all decisions made in the EU forever after. And of course, it would enable free movement of jihadis that Recep Tayyip Erdogan allowed to cross from Turkey into the Islamic State when the Islamic State controlled territory in Iraq and Syria, that'd just be able to stroll into Europe with no trouble whatsoever, or even less trouble than they have now. But of course, for many reasons of short-sighted realpolitik, there are many people today who still think, well, we can do business with somebody like Erdogan. And John Kerry went a few years back and said, I do wish you would not buy ISIS oil. And Erdogan told him to get lost. Because Erdogan he wants to restore the caliphate, he wants to restore Islamic government in Turkey, and he doesn't care about the alliance with the United States. It's only the people in the State Department who think, well, we have to have this at whatever cost. And we cannot reevaluate it in light of these realities because they don't even acknowledge that these realities exist. It's still an entrenched view in the State Department and the intelligence communities that Islam and jihad are completely benign and have nothing whatsoever, as Hillary Clinton said, you know, Muslims are peaceful and tolerant people who have nothing whatsoever to do with terrorism. She said it. So I believe that if the facts that are in this book were considered by policymakers, they would lead to massive changes in many foreign and domestic policies. One of them would be a reconfiguration of our international alliances to strengthen our alliances with states that are threatened by the jihad. Of course, most notably Israel, which the President has already done a great deal to strengthen our alliance with, and India, and other states that are facing a very severe jihad threat, and a recognition that our alliances with states such as Turkey and Pakistan are essentially shams. And it is indeed to the President's credit that he is already moving in this direction. And that's one of the great achievements of his administration. Not only is he cutting off the Palestinians' funding, but also has put sanctions on Turkey and Pakistan as well. And cut the funding to Pakistan as well, not sanctions on Pakistan. And so we can only hope that that will continue and that our foreign policy will finally move from Cold War models. The Cold War is over, except in the Democratic National Committee, and move to a recognition of the new realities of the world, which are actually ancient realities that go back 1,400 years and continue throughout in the history of jihad. And domestically, we need to reevaluate the Muslim organizations in the United States, recognize that the Muslim Brotherhood is indeed a terrorist organization, as it should be designated, that it is dedicated to establishing a caliphate, and thus is an intrinsically subversive organization for anybody who is sworn to uphold the Constitution, and that consequently the Muslim Brotherhood-linked organizations in the United States need to be very carefully investigated. And we, of course, need to call upon Muslims in the United States to renounce the aspects of Islam that are at variance with constitutional principles. And not just in word, but in deed, to institute programs that teach against the understanding of Islam that is represented by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, to teach the necessity of secular rule, of non-establishment of a religion, and so on, and how that allows for people of vastly different perspectives to live together in peace, rather than one group trying to gain hegemony over the other. But we can't even have these conversations, of course, because they are stigmatized under the rubrics of racism and bigotry and hatred and Islamophobia. If we do not, however, get over that and have these national discussions, then there is no doubt that the jihad will continue to advance against the United States and that our freedoms will ultimately be subverted. And so I submit that to you today, that in your positions of influence and activism, even in your social circles and so on, I hope that you will bring an awareness of these things and try to influence as many people as possible, because of course we know that it's getting late and even our platform to speak is being cut out from under us. But we do have one invincible weapon on our side, and that is that we're telling the truth. The propagandists always have to keep propagating the big lie because it's a lie. And because, you know, I can open my eyes and see what's happening. And so if they want to fool me into thinking that reality is other than what I see, then they have to keep repeating these lies. And this is why we constantly are being told that Islam is a religion of peace and that Islamophobia is a bigger problem than jihad terrorism and so on. But the truth is reality, and reality will always break through. And so I think times are going to be very difficult for a while, but if we continue to tell the truth, then ultimately we cannot lose. Thank you very much.
We got time for a couple of questions. We'll start with Ron.
Ron, how are you doing?
Good.
Yes.
Robert, how ensconced is the Muslim Brotherhood in Washington, D.C.? How ensconced are they in the Democratic Party?
I think basically they call the shots. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, you remember several years ago, Representative Michelle Bachmann called for an investigation of Muslim Brotherhood influence in the Obama administration and named names of Muslim Brotherhood operatives who were in the administration. And St. John McCain went on the Senate floor and denounced her as a racist, bigoted Islamophobe, and there was no investigation. Now, the reality is that there were people who had Muslim Brotherhood ties who were in the administration. Many of them, they appointed other people who they knew would be compliant into positions that they still hold. And so it's something that needs to be the focus of an investigation. I think it's a primary reason why the Brotherhood has not been declared a terrorist organization thus far, because there are too many people who are entrenched who are making sure it ain't going to happen. And so right now, of course, I think there is the great struggle with the deep state. One of the great things about Donald Trump being elected president, of course, is that we know about this. If Hillary had won, then all these traitorous operatives would be still entrenched in the government and we would have no idea. Now we know, but it's going to be a hard struggle to beat them in any case, and we'll see how it works out. But the Brotherhood influence is all part of that.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
A couple of years back, President al-Sisi of Egypt called for a reformation of Islam, but his reformation idea was to bring Islam into conformity with Western civilization and abandon the whole jihadist concept. Whatever happened to that? Where is it going? And second question, could you comment on the Islamophobia industry in the United States?
Certainly. In the first place, Sisi, it's going nowhere. Nothing happened. And I knew nothing ever would happen. He was speaking to the Islamic clerics of Al-Azhar in Cairo, which is the foremost institution in Sunni Islam, where Barack Obama made his outreach speech to the Muslim world in 2009. But they know what's in the Quran. They know what Muhammad taught. They know what's in Islamic history. And so they smiled and nodded to Sisi, but they can't. There was never any chance that they were going to reform Islam and remove jihad violence from it. Jihad violence is taught in the Quran and by Muhammad. There's no getting around that. The Quran says in chapter 5, verse 3, "This day I have perfected your religion for you." If it's perfect, you don't need to fix it.
Okay. We have a question.
Oh, there was a second part. Don't tell me. I know I'm getting old, but what was it?
The Islamophobia.
Islamophobia industry, yeah. The Islamophobia industry is an interesting turn of phrase for you, because the Islamophobia industry is usually what they say, David Horowitz and I, and Frank Gaffney and Pamela Geller and a few other people. That's us. But the real Islamophobia industry is the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Al-Walid bin Talal Center at Georgetown University, and these other organizations that are trying to fool people into thinking that there is Islamophobia. Islamophobia is the conflation of two concepts. One is vigilante attacks on innocent Muslims, which nobody supports. The second is honest analysis of the teachings of Islam in order to understand how the jihadis use those teachings to justify violence and make recruits among peaceful Muslims. The left uses the term Islamophobia to deal with both. And that way they suggest, they try to imply that Horowitz and Geller and Gaffney and me and all the others, that we support violence against Muslims. But what they're really trying to do is use the term to silence all dissent and to stigmatize anybody who speaks honestly about these issues. And I'm sorry to tell you, it's working great. Because the Southern Poverty Law Center, with their list of anti-Muslim extremists and Islamophobes and so on, they're taken seriously as a reliable source for what constitutes a hate group. And so on that basis, of course, MasterCard and Discover Card won't allow donations to Jihad Watch because they're trying to cut out the hate groups. And Keith Ellison, the Muslim Brotherhood congressman, he actually wrote to Jeff Bezos at Amazon, and he said, he demanded that Amazon stop selling books by people who were listed as hate group leaders by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which would mean David's books and my books and the books of many other people would just be gone. And of course, you know, it was the Nazis who burnt books. It's totalitarian regimes that try to limit thought. And we're getting very close to this. And the idea that there is an Islamophobia industry that is other than, I mean, they have the real Islamophobia industry, but the idea that it's us is part of the propaganda that they are spreading to try to silence dissent from their agenda.
Did the Southern Poverty Law Center just settle a lawsuit?
Yes.
$3.5 million?
Yeah, they gave $3.5 million to Majid Nawaz, who's a Muslim in Britain, who was listed as an anti-Muslim extremist, and he was able to sue them. He had the advantage of being British, because Britain has libel laws that favor the plaintiff, whereas libel laws in the US favor the defendant. And so, while it's very heartening that he was able to settle, and I hope that I and others will be able to sue the Southern Poverty Law Center eventually, it is harder here.
Okay, we have a question here, and then we're going to go over to Bill.
Hello.
Hi, Robert. Have you had an opportunity to meet with President Trump yet? And
No.
if not, is there a chance that you can spend some time alone with him?
I'll tell you
in the
something,
near
if he
future?
calls me, I'll go. But nobody has reached out to me. I do know personally several people in the administration.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't name them on the video here, I don't know, but it doesn't really matter.
Kellyanne?
No, I don't know her. But I do know some people there, and they've never called me. I'm not hurt by this. It's okay. I know the tremendous pressure that they would receive were it known that I was talking to him. But I'm happy to. If it can be arranged, I'll go. But I'm not waiting by the phone.
Well, I sure hope you get a chance to do it.
Try to go through a couple. I think Lori, Bill, and then Jeff.
Okay.
Do you have any sense of what the average Muslim knows about all this history? Or in other words, what does the average Muslim think Islam represents?
The average Muslim. Well, see, that's in the first place, that's a little bit of a difficult concept because you're talking about over 1 billion people, you know? And so it's very hard to generalize. But I would say there is a greater awareness among Muslims of history than there is among Americans. That, for example, Muslims will know who the Tariq ibn Ziyad Academy is named for. They know who that is. It's not just some name to them. And you know, you have the King Fahad Mosque over here in Culver City. The King Fahad Mosque, it's got a sign out front. I was there, and it says King Fahad Mosque. But then in Arabic, it says Masjid Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah was an Islamic scholar in the Middle Ages who taught very, very strongly that it was very important to wage violent jihad and subjugate the Jews and Christians. And I think, isn't it interesting that they only put that on the sign in Arabic and not in English? So nobody really knows that the mosque is the Ibn Taymiyyah mosque, but it is. And Muslims will know who Ibn Taymiyyah was and what that represents. I think that in general, we need to recover a sense of history that is much more present in the Islamic world than among Americans.
Robert, what is
Yes,
your
sir.
understanding of the level of knowledge of significant congresspeople, senators, and representatives and so forth? Do they understand half or a fraction of what you understand about Islam?
I don't think so. I don't think any of them do. I think there's some great congressmen, of course, who do wonderful work, and I don't mean to insult any of them. Louis Gohmert, of course, has been heroic in, if you're ever feeling down, watch him grilling Robert Mueller years ago about the Boston Mosque. If you haven't seen that one, go and find it on YouTube. Mueller was the head of the FBI at the time, and it was right after the Boston Marathon bombing, and Louis is asking him, did you ever investigate this mosque? Did you ever have guys go to this mosque at all? And Mueller's very defensive, and he says, yes, we had agents go to that mosque for outreach. And this is a mosque, the Islamic Society of Boston. There are so many jihad terrorists who've gone there. There was Tariq Mahana, who aided al-Qaeda. There was the chief computer tech expert for ISIS. There were, of course, the Tsarnaev brothers, the Boston Marathon bombers. Afia Siddiqui, who's doing 86 years for fighting against American soldiers for al-Qaeda. And this mosque has never been investigated. So, in short, yeah, generally the congressmen, the senators, they don't know anything about this.
This will be the last question, Robert.
Okay.
I want to know if you could get your thoughts on the current Israel-Saudi relationship, also the relationships with all the Gulf states, and how you see what's the developments with Saudi Arabia with the 2030 plan, and in terms of this current state, in terms of where.
Yes. Israel's working with the Saudis and with the Gulf states. This is positive, but we should keep it in perspective that this is an alliance of convenience. They both have, Saudis and Israel have a mutual threat in Iran. And they recognize that it's a mutual threat, and so they're working together to deal with that threat. The Saudis have not actually reformed as much as they've cracked up to be reforming. Mohammed bin Ibn Salman, the crown prince, he has made it very clear that he's not going to reform anything, he's not going to change anything in a way that would contravene the teachings of Islam. And that means that the Islamic anti-Semitism that is deeply embedded in the Quran, and principally the idea that is in chapter 2, verse 191 of the Quran, that says, drive them out from where they drove you out. That's the basis of the Palestinian Jihad. The idea is that, I mean, of course, it's not even true that they were driven out, but the idea is that the Arabs were driven out of Israel, and thus they have a responsibility before Allah to drive out the Israelis. It's not subject to any negotiations or mitigation. So the Saudis are not going to give that up. They've aided that for years. They're going to keep on doing it, but they will be happy to work with Israel against Iran. Just recently, the Crown Prince reforms notwithstanding, the Saudis announced that they were going to give fines and prison terms to people who insulted Islam, people who drew cartoons of Muhammad, or engaged in satire that hurt religious sensibilities. And so that's not reform. That's just retrenchment of the same old attitudes. So I'm glad that the Saudis are working with the Israelis against Iran, because Iran is a very real threat. At the same time, we need to keep a realistic understanding of how far that's going to go. Once Iran, if the Iranian regime were to fall, and a more sane regime were to be instituted there that was not a threat, then the Saudis would stop working with Israel.
Robert, there actually is one last question right here. So this will be the last question.
Robert, what about the ongoing problem in Europe with the immigration of the Muslims, and what are the implications for the future of the U.S. given that phenomenon?
It's a massive problem in Europe. There is in the Quran, in chapter 4, verse 100, Allah promises rewards, great rewards, to those who emigrate in the cause of Allah. To emigrate in the cause of Allah is to leave your country and go to another one, but not just to get a job or whatever, but to bring Islam to the new land. There is no doubt that there are some of the migrants who are in Europe precisely to do that. because they have said so. And it's not hard to find the video evidence of this, or it may be getting harder to find if they're going to close down all the fonts of information. But in any case, there are many of the migrants who've made public avowals of that. Also, of course, there's the terror threat. All 8 of the attackers in Paris, who killed 130 people in November 2015, had just arrived in Europe as refugees in October 2015. And there are many, many other examples. The Lebanese education minister actually said right around that same time that there were 20,000 active jihadis in the refugee camps in his country waiting to get to Europe. So this is something this is tantamount to Europe committing suicide. And in the name of diversity and multiculturalism, they are bringing in a large number of people, among whom there are some who will think that their model of society and governance is better than that of Europe, and they need to replace the one with the other. The Quran says to Muslims, "You are the best of people on earth." It's chapter 3, verse 110. And the non-Muslims are the most vile of created beings. This is chapter 98, verse 6. The best of people on earth, if you believe that, you're not likely to accept the customs and the mores of the most vile of created beings. You're going to think, I'm going to bring our own laws, which are the laws of Allah and are perfect and immutable, bring them to this land and emigrate, and then having emigrated in the cause of Allah, then they will receive those rewards. This is something that has been very, of course, thoroughly ignored by the establishment media, by the political elites in Europe. There's no discussion allowed of any of these Islamic principles or of the possibility that they might be being implemented. But we are going to face the same thing. There's not been some reform or rejection or reconsideration of any of these things. There's not some different Quran or different Islam that American Muslims have. So we're just a little bit farther down the road because the Muslim population is not as large here. But once it will be, we'll be facing exactly the same things that they're facing in Europe. So on that happy note, thank you all for coming. Always a pleasure.